No?
Here we are.
Rewind that.
We're live now.
Good morning. Today is Wednesday, November 29th, 2023. It's 8:30 a.m. and this is the opening of our next meeting of the Renewable Energy Standard Reform Working Group. We have a full agenda, so jump right in. We have several of our members, the legislative members aren't here. Thanks to everyone who made it. I know that travel is a little difficult this morning. Snow and ice on the road. Expect co-chair Sheldon to arrive shortly, and as well as other members, such as Representative Sibilia. So with that, I can turn it over to Jen Nauer. We'll go over the agenda and get underway.
So there's the agenda. I want to thank TJ Poor, the Director of Regulated Utility Planning at the State of Vermont, and Ben Walsh from Vermont Public Interest Research Group, and also Louis Porter from the Washington Electric Club. I know you were pretty busy on that day, but the three of you volunteered at the last meeting to research a couple of questions. So we'll start off the agenda with a report out from whatever you found and discovered. Most of this meeting is devoted to the straw poll and discussion prompts that were listed in the agenda. There are two breaks, and it might be a little awkward. The conversation is probably going to pick up speed and be pretty dense. You'll be covering a lot of ground, but there are two breaks scheduled for 9:50 and for 10:50, I believe. Yeah. And then public comment is at 11:45 today, adjourning at noon. Any questions about the agenda? Okay, TJ, if you're ready, then let's go with report out.
Yeah. No announcements.
I'm going to stop you sharing the screen here.
Of course. So there will be a chance for a Q&A while TJ pulls up his screen. I think you'll have an overview, and then at 10 to 12 minutes or so, we'll stop for Q&A.
Great.
All right.
That sounds good. And so thanks, TJ Poor, Director of Planning at the Department of Public Service. Ben and I met on Monday, really kind of briefly, and Jonathan from Ed was also there. Louis, unfortunately, was unable to make it, dealing with all the outages from the Sunday night storm. We spoke at a high level about the request to the group to kind of examine what the impact would be of using different prices in the model. If folks recall, there was a 14-cent price used for small kind of standard offer size, 2 megawatt projects, solar projects in the model. And, it was suggested that we use the recent standard offer pricing, and Ben provided some data that we just on the standard offer pricing, we ultimately ran the model with roughly 10.5-cent price for those size projects. And so I'm just going to get into the results here really quickly. These slides I sent out to folks late last night, so Ben Lewis, part of that team, has probably not had much of a chance to see them. But first, I just want to remind folks, the timelines for the technical analysis in this working group have not been perfectly aligned. So just a reminder that a lot of the data from the model that we're sharing, it's been going through the stakeholder process, the stakeholder advisory group process, but it is still draft and it is non-final. And so it continues to evolve. So the model is helpful for, giving us some direction and saying, hey, what does this look like? But we're still very open to continuing to update and post revisions as we work together to kind of figure out what levers to pull really make the biggest difference in impact. It's really a tool to facilitate that conversation that will happen, throughout the legislative session, I anticipate. And I put some things on this slide here that I anticipate further discussion on, more looking at prices that are in there, on the other end, kind of grid impact costs, penetration of net metering is I think a pretty significant variable in here, and I know you've talked about that in this group a bit. And I'll talk a little bit about alternative compliance payment that actually makes a difference in the model, I think, as well. So here's the request, which I just talked about, and I think I said everything on the slide. In interest of time, I'll move on. So in updating the prices, I debated whether to even necessary to share this, but I think it's important just for transparency that SEA discovered an error in the model, the original model, that caused the alternative compliance payment to be artificially low. And that was depressing the estimated costs in the previous version of the model. So that like obscured, when we went to run the difference in price, it was like, well, what's going on here? There's not any difference. And then they found this formula error in the alternative compliance payment. And so it really obscured the impact of the change of pricing for distribution connected systems. And so this slide kind of, it may be a little hard to see if you're far away. If you look at on the left.
Sorry to interrupt. Quick question on the alternative compliance payment. So it can act as a cap, right? And so does the model show pressure enough that instead of investments in infrastructure, that money was starting to flow into the ACP?
Correct. Yes. So what we have here is the left is the slides that are presented November 14th and 15th to this group, but 14th to the stakeholder advisory group. I've shown the rate impact slide here only because the cost side is really where this impacts and it's easier to see than the societal test slide. And then the November 27th update, which includes both fixing the ACP issue and lowering the prices. And you can see, you know, there's not a big difference in these charts. On the right-hand side, the costs are actually even a little higher than they were originally. And so once we basically put the ACP at what it should be, like what it is now, increasing with inflation, instead of actually it was defining in the original version of the model that more costs were borne, right? It didn't, the costs weren't capped. I can tell you I was very happy when I found this. This is not like good news in any respect. It didn't have a good directional impact, and it just was not, well, it's obviously not ideal. But I wanted to make sure you all knew and share this, and, you know, happy to work with folks if they want to better understand the issue. So,
can I ask a quick? If you discovered that the alternative compliance costs had been lower and now it's higher, right? So, and I would have thought that had the inverse impact, because so you're estimating that a bunch of people will pay that as opposed to build, right?
instead of building, yeah,
Instead of building, but at the same time, you've adjusted downward the cost of building.
So let me try and explain. I think I might have explained that poorly. So the ACP was acting as a cap on cost. So we raised that cap to what is kind of the current ACP trajectory right now. And so now the costs to build were kind of above what they were, above that artificially low cap. And so the costs then are higher, even with a reduction in price.
But if that, but wouldn't the model also have to assume, therefore, that fewer people would pay the penalty and just build, because you've also brought down in the modeling? That's what I'm not hearing is a change in the assumption of how many people would just pay the.
Right, so they are, but then it's above the level of the artificially low cap. So they're choosing to build now instead because the ACP is much higher, or you could almost call it unconstrained in this scenario. And so they're choosing to build, but it's at a higher cost than what the artificial cap was. Like the cap was going down into like the $40 megawatt hour, and the cost assumed in the model.
Thank you.
So I did want to isolate the change in price only, just to get a sense of the impact of what was actually asked, right? So what I did on the left-hand side here, we have the November 27th update. So the ACP issue is fixed, and we're at 10.5 cents a kilowatt hour. On the right side, I ran the model using kind of the updated model with the fixed ACP, using the older prices. And so we still see that there wasn't that big of a price difference. There was still, even with the higher ACP, a little bit of paying the ACP in the right-hand side model. But, examining what this, what the issue is that the size category of those solar was 10 megawatts a year. So when we're looking at, scenario 2 here is the 30% tier 2 target, and you're seeing about a $30 million difference over time. And that's really, 30% tier 2 is 90 megawatts roughly a year of new solar, maybe 60 of incremental new solar. And so only 10 megawatts of that was affected by this price change. And so that's one of the reasons why it's kind of small here, $30 million difference. The last thing I wanted to share is in our discussion on Monday. So the prices in the model now, with that change to 10.5 cents for kind of those smaller 2 megawatt size projects, were roughly the same as up to 5 megawatt projects. And Jonathan Dowds at Rev, when we were talking, said, hey, shouldn't there be at least some price difference there? That, these bigger projects do have some economies of scale. That's what we're hearing from our members. I do not have any data to support this, but I wanted to run what the impact was, because if not a lot of projects are coming from those smaller standard offer size 2 megawatt projects, it means a lot of the solar is coming from the bigger projects, like 2 megawatts to 5 megawatts. So what I did is I took 90% of that, the 10.4 cents a kilowatt hour price, to say, okay, what happens to the model? What's the impact here? And so we see that 90% is like about a penny of a difference in price. And we see that there is about a $45 million difference. So a bigger difference just in changing the price a little bit for those bigger projects. So I wanted to share all that. I just have a couple of takeaways. This is my last slide, and then we can have more discussion. Basically, the pricing changes can have a significant impact. The ones that evaluated ultimately are relatively minor in the scale of costs that we're talking about. We're not talking about benefits here today, but $45 million on 600 million in one of those scenarios. It's not nothing, but it's less than 10% difference. And so, but that said,
just to make sure, so these are the figures you're sharing. The 45 million is over what time period? This is
through 20, that was the net present value of the cost over
over the lifetime.
yes, yeah. So the smaller front of the meter project cost makes less of a difference than other options. I think there's a couple of areas in the first, I know you all have been raised net metering a number of times, and I think that's going to be a topic of discussion, some policy changes with net metering. There's a significant amount of net metering in this model. And if we, create different options for access to renewable energy through community solar, you may be able to have a significant impact on the cost. A reasonable alternative compliance payment if folks think, hey, that's crazy. In the outer years, the ACP is at like $85, $95 a megawatt hour, 9 cents a kilowatt hour. That if policymakers want to cap the costs of that could have a significant difference. Say if we kept it at $60 a megawatt hour and say that's the most we're willing to pay, the model would capture that and show a significant difference. That would reduce the benefits also, to be clear, but it would reduce the costs. And I just will share again that we're very willing to continue to collaborate, look into assumptions in the model. The model's posted on our website. The updated one should be posted by the time we're through with this meeting. And happy to continue to work with folks to make sure there's at least common understanding, if not agreement on the assumptions.
TJ, can you remind us of if a utility pays to ACP, where do those revenues go and how are they expended? Under the current
renewable energy standard, they're directed to the Clean Energy Development Fund, and there's been no meaningful payments of the ACP since the renewable energy standard started. So they would be spent as directed by that board.
Thanks.
We have 2 questions online. How many others are sitting on a question for TJ? And I'm asking, so I'm trying to get a sense of time. Is it a good time to open it up for questions then? So Ken and then Mia.
Thanks. TJ, can you just remind me, how are interconnection costs handled in this study? I mean, I get the 1 cent reduction for larger solar projects themselves, but we tend to see those larger projects bring with them pretty substantial interconnection costs. So I'm curious if that's excluded or included or how that's treated.
Yeah, so interconnection costs that are needed to actually interconnect the project are included in the analysis. Right now, and this is one of the things that I've been saying we're still working on, is interconnection costs that are more the culmination of lots of projects across a system locating and that are needed to kind of create more headroom on the system, but there's not kind of one entity that's able to pay them, are not included. And so that's a tricky one, but it's because it's not, like a 1 megawatt project on a generation constrained system is not going to be able to pay for, an $8 million upgrade, right? But on the other hand, but assuming the entire $8 million upgrade is caused by distributed generation is not right either, because there, could be asset condition upgrades in 5 or 10 years that might have happened anyway, or 15 years or whenever, or only a portion of the costs are really directed to the interconnecting facility. The other way that interconnection costs are counted in the model is that all interconnection costs, a portion of them are assumed to have a benefit to the system. So for any facility connecting, the interconnection portion of the costs, I believe, subject to check, I believe 25% of those costs are assumed to circle back as a benefit to the grid. So Yeah.
I just like to point out for the committee, I mean, we're negotiating two projects right now that are on circuits without any, both of them on circuits without any other solar. And in one case, the interconnection's coming in about $600,000, and the other, it's $1.1 million. So that's not items or issues created by multiple projects. It's just where they're located. So I get saying the solar projects themselves can be cheaper, but I think the interconnection's very dependent on where they're located and what else is on those circuits. So, thanks.
Okay. A follow-up question?
Yeah. So TJ, how does the model deal with just regardless of what happens on the build out of additional renewables or interconnection costs? How is it dealing with anticipated load growth because of electrification of thermal and transportation modes?
Right. There are two forecasts in the model, and one is a base forecast that I believe is I looked at this in a while. I believe it's based on kind of the business as usual assumptions that we have. They've been updated through separate effort on the clean heat study work, but closely tied into the Belco work. And then there's a high forecast that is our higher forecast that is the electrification scenario meeting our climate action requirements.
And can you put into scale like those just grid investments required for electrification of other loads compared to like interconnection costs? I'm just trying to see it as like, is it only 10%? Because really there's a much larger anticipated expense related to just grid upgrades, period, or it's 50% of that cost?
Utilities in the room may be better able to answer that on the fly. I can say that in the Vermont System Planning Committee, which is a group of transmission distribution planners that meets regularly, every year utilities are required to indicate what investments they're making that are related to load growth. And there has been zero load growth related investments for the last several years, at least 5.
I might be able to give one example that might be helpful. So we have 2 substations we need to upgrade. Those upgrades to the transformers are largely due to solar on those substations. But in order to put a bigger transformer on there, we need to rebuild the structure of the substation, which is an old wooden substation structure. Now, I wouldn't suggest ever assigning all those costs to the solar because it's a wooden substation. It needs to get rebuilt at some point anyway. But it's very difficult to parse out exactly because we would not be increasing the size of the transformers absent the solar. And so we wouldn't technically have to replace the sub, but we probably would over time anyway, just as a housekeeping, maintenance measure. Keep in mind that a lot of the utilities have been experiencing flat or declining load growth for a while due to efficiency. Theoretically, that provides headroom. In reality, we're entering a time in which we're going to probably see load growth on top of the additional solar. So I don't know if that's helpful at all, but the short answer is it's very hard to parse out when you get to an actual project and assign those costs inaccurately, at least for us.
Mia, go ahead.
Thanks. This might be a bit of a basic question for this group, but I'm still a little lost at the connection between, cost increases of these scenarios and the rate increases. And I keep being struck by the data from the working group that TJ showed last week that showed that the rate impact over the next decade over business as usual was pretty small. And I don't want to take us on a huge tangent, but TJ, I wonder if you could just explain some of the factors that make these cost increases somewhat minor compared to, the actual, the rate increases small in comparison to the different costs of the different scenarios. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, just really quickly, I think you're right. The rate impacts that have been associated with these different scenarios are between 2% and 5%. And the reason that looks small, like even the $600 million number that was on the high end there, probably 5%, that's over 15 years or till 2035. So if you make that an annual impact, you're talking a smaller number, right? $6-8 million a year. Sorry, I probably shouldn't do math on the fly. Say $50 million a year. That's an easy number. If the total revenue collected by utilities in the state is $1 billion, then that's a 5% rate impact. And so, in $1 billion, 900 million in that range, a little more has been the recent collections from utilities in the state. So if you round that up to $1 billion and say 50 million a year, that's where you get 5%. So the dollar amounts are big and nominally and are real. When you take that annual dollar amount and put it against a much bigger number of what the state collects in revenue every year from electric utilities or electric ratepayers, then it looks smaller.
Mia, does that answer your question?
I think so. Thanks.
Are there other questions? I'm feeling some pressure to move into the anticipated straw polling and discussion prompts. And if there are other questions for TJ, let me know. Okay. TJ, thank you. And I understand you'll be available as needed if there are other questions that come out or if you need to reference something in the modeling while you're discussing later in the meeting.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
You want me to go? Stay?
If you're comfortable there, I think we'll actually,
Okay.
but yeah, let's shift. Yeah, have wherever you're comfortable, TJ.
All
right. So let's shift gears to the straw polling and discussion of proposed amendments as currently drafted by the legislative team. Ellen Kofsky, Legislative Counsel, if you're able to join us. Again, you're also here on an as-needed basis because as you wade into this technical territory and starting to play with language, Ellen, your questions and clarifications are really helpful. So thank you. Also joining us at 10:15 for about half an hour will be Dean Murphy and Monjung Chang from the Brattle Group. So if there are questions from that modeling that you need them to answer, they'll be here for half an hour, so we'll collect them and be online. Pull up slides or clarify as needed. So the anticipated straw polls and discussion prompts have been outlined in the agenda. Those of you who are online or watching from the live stream can find that on the working group webpage. They'll be considered in order in which they appear in the list. So generally tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and then the overall renewable energy standard goals. Straw polls, I just want to emphasize it's a straw poll in part because this is the rationale here is to make visible the thinking about where some of the reform areas might land. It's a hypothesis. It's trying to shape some specific proposals out of what has been a very rambling conversation. So the straw poll is helpful in its conciseness and that it gets a little bit of a snapshot on where you're standing, but then there's also going to be a period where it'd be really helpful to know what's top of mind, why you're for or against a certain proposal, or if you have something specific to suggest that's different. But you will see me start to get a little angsty in the seat if your comments go too long, and that's because trying to cut the the longer arguments into very specific feedback points that the legislative team can then take after this meeting and continue to work with. So straw polls will be taken via a show of hands, followed by brief opportunities to comment, in some cases limiting that comment to 20 to 30 seconds per point. Or I should say per speaker. Again, breaks at 9:50 and 10:50. Are there any questions about how this might unfold before we begin and try it out? Go ahead, William.
Just real quick technical, when we show hands, should we show hands electronically or physically? Just questions or votes kind of thing.
It's a great question. And I think the awkwardness here is for those of you online, you're gonna have a harder time seeing those show of hands here in the room. But if you're online, if you can use your virtual hand, it will be a quicker count for us on this end. Any other questions? That's a great one. All right. Co-chairs, am I forgetting anything so far?
I think one thing is legislative members of the committee have sort of held back in that sort of listening mode. And I'm guessing that in this round of straw polling, you're anticipating we would vote. Is that correct?
You're not planning to vote?
No, if we put this out, I'd like to hear what they think about it. You can vote if you want.
Well, I just want to get it clear one way or the other.
That's fair.
So I don't know that if I have guidance on that. I will say, though, that this is an excellent opportunity to ask questions that you might have or clarify certain elements, so that if you have a question, now is the time to try to get it answered. So it might be that those questions have more value than the actual votes at this point. Okay. So let's try this out and see how it goes. I think I've not thought through this little intersection, but what we ought to do is review what the proposed change is and then just follow 1 through 3. There's actually in tier 1, 5 different questions, I think. We'll just follow through, see how work through them.
Are we looking at the pre-meeting survey?
No, actually, I'm looking at the agenda and there's proposed amendments listed at the bottom of today's agenda. Ellen, I would invite you to say what that proposed language is. It's just the language in bold, and just if anyone has any questions about what that is, and then we will go through the questions.
Sure. Ellen Tchaikovsky, Office of Legislative Counsel. So Tier 1 as it currently exists is in 30 VSA 8005 A1B, and we're talking about total renewable energy as required. Currently, the statute increases total renewable energy to 75% in 2032, and so the proposal is to go to 100% in 2030. Do you want me to stop there? You want me to go to the next bullet?
Well, I think you were doing a little bit of thinking about what that might require for an increase in rates.
Right. So related to that thought, which I don't think we've had a ton of discussion on in this group, is that you're not only, in that proposal, you're not only changing the amount of renewable energy that would be required, but also the rate of increase, because you're changing the year as well. So I'm a lawyer, not a math person, so I think my math is not exactly precise, but by changing the year as well, currently the statute requires an increase of 4% every third year. And so in order to get to 2030, that would need to change to something around 10.6% every other year, or something else, or a different rate of increase depending on what the committee's pleasure was. I did just want to point out that it would be an increase in the yearly amount that will be required as well.
We'll take each of those three questions in turn, starting with the increase in the percentage and then the timing and then how that rate increase might be handled if it's applicable at that time. And the agenda has now been posted to the chat for those of you who might want to see how those questions laid out. You can find it there if you're logged in. Any questions before I'm about to ask a straw poll around the increase in total renewable energy and if it should increase to 100%. Are there any clarifying questions first? Okay, so a show of hands. Should the increase in total renewable energy for tier 1 increase to 100%? If yes, please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the room, 7 in the room. And online, keep your hands up. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Oh my gosh, this is going to be trickier than I thought. I need a second counter.
Six on screen. 6
on screen and in room again, please raise your hand. 7. Thank you. So that's 13 yes. If you believe that the total should not increase to 100%, please raise your hand. In the room and online. 2 online. Anyone in the room? 1. So 3 no. Those of you who voted no in that straw poll, I'd invite a clarification or a statement about what your reservation is.
We previously identified a desire to get to 100% clean.
100% clean as opposed to renewable. So for you, it's about whether it's termed renewable or clean.
Okay.
Others who voted no, is there a comment you wanted to share about why?
Sure. I similarly, we think that the options for clean should still be part of the mix. I don't think we should close the door on evolving technologies that may come up. And I still have some questions about battery and storage and other issues to deal with intermittency if we move to 100% renewable in such a short time frame.
There was a third person who voted no. Did you have a comment that you'd like to share?
I'll add, Jen, I abstained and in part because I personally in my role haven't seen the data that we're going to have access to about impacts on low income households, which I would like to see and I think is relevant. I know it's hard to get that modeling done, but for me that's an important point.
Is that data going to be available? And if so, when? Does anyone know? Yeah, Joyce.
Yeah, so that's a question for the Brattle Group, and they plan to have final results early next week, or a week ago. We should ask that question at 10:15.
Yeah, so the question is, what impact would going up to 100% have on rates?
Low-income household rates.
Low-income household rates. Co-chairs, do you have any questions?
Was the third no Velco? And if so, I'd like to know why.
The microphone isn't working, Shauna. That's so frustrating. I'm sorry.
It's really important.
Yeah, it does. I'm gonna wonder if we can ask you to unmute and see if that makes a difference.
You're muted.
It didn't make a difference. I'm sorry, Shauna. So if if you want to call in the lower left, that drop-up menu will the calling in would probably be quicker. It will give you prompts right there, a number to call, and you can just switch to phone audio. I know it's a pain in the neck, but let's just give it a minute so that we can hear what is top of mind.
Yeah, you want to hear a reason two? Yeah.
If that's useful to you,
Yeah,
yes.
well, I just said it at meeting one and want to reiterate, to me, we live in a time of vast economic inequality, and that means it has profound impacts on people. And when we go to 100% renewable on the grid, we provide completely equitable access to the clean energy future that we're always talking about as essential. And so I feel like that's a foundational concern for how we evolve as a state. Make sure everyone's part of the future as opposed to those who can
Can the
afford
group
it.
hear me now?
Yes.
That's
Thank
very-
you. If the question was Velco responding no, no, I did raise my hand in response to yes.
Oh, okay.
Oh, interesting.
Thank you for clarifying.
Can I just do a double check? Who raised their hand for no? I had 3 different votes. 1 in the room. I thought I had 2 online.
I think it was Shannon.
Bill Driscoll. And who was the third?
I think it was Shannon.
Oh.
Yeah. So, okay.
Yeah, I believe Shanna raised yes and just didn't take it down.
Okay, great, thank you.
So how many votes?
I think I have 13 and 2. 1 abstaining, but there's probably a couple others of you who didn't vote on that one. Okay, thank you. For a straw poll, does that give you the insight that you needed?
Yep.
So moving on to question 2. Should the increase in total renewable energy in Tier 1 take place in 2030? If you believe yes, please raise your hand. Nice and tall if you're in the room, especially that's helpful for the folks online. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in the room. And online, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 11 yes, 5 yes. Online, 12? 12 yes. Okay, everyone can put their hands down. If you believe, no, there should not, the increase in total renewable energy should not take place in 2030. Please raise your hand. It means it would be later. Raise your hand nice and high so that folks in online can see. 1 in the room. Any online? 2 online, 3 online. That's 4 total. Those of you who said no to that, when do you think that if there was be an increase in total renewable energy to Tier 1, what's the timing that you have in mind?
We're focused on 2032 right now, and our planning is around 2032. So I would go to 2032, 2035 with a more gentle ramp.
Others?
I think, was that Jeff speaking?
It was.
I agree with him. I think I voted yes for 100% renewable, but I think moving the timeline up disrupts some of the utility planning that's already underway. And it increases the potential early rate impacts for what I would consider very minimal benefits for 2 additional years.
Other comments? And if so, you can be clear about whether you voted yes or no for 2030. Those of you who voted yes for any increase to take place in 2030, your rationale? What is the rationale for moving? Yes.
I guess I would
Christopher.
offer, we're really late. I mean, the climate crisis is not approaching, right? We're in the middle of it. And importantly, we're hearing this is feasible, I think, from the bulk of the utilities. So that's pretty informative. I wish we were doing it by 2025, but 2030 seems not out of the realm. It's aggressive, you know, but I think that matches where we're at, or begins to match where we're at in terms of the climate crisis.
So I'm sorry to do this, but I actually would like to hear from one of the utilities that voted yes. Particularly on a, week like this week where we once again have seen such damage to our infrastructure from climate change. So the three of you represent the most rural parts of the state, which I'm really concerned about in terms of the res and the pace that we go and making sure we can harden that grid. So would any of you be willing to share why? You're okay with this timeframe?
Yeah, for us, it's simply that we had already made a commitment and adjusted our planning timeline to 2030. So I very much respect the other utilities who haven't done that yet. And so that's why it's feasible for us. So
I would echo that. That's also been a GMP planning, and as part of our planning, and our goal for a few years now is to be 100% renewable by 2030. So it's very consistent with all the work that we've been doing as well.
And I won't say it's easy for us because we need to accommodate load growth, but we've been 100% renewable for years now and have no plans to not be. So similarly, our plans have included that. So being 100% renewable now and going forward. So.
Do you have other questions you'd like to ask? So the next question 3, and this may be discussion first, followed by a straw poll if appropriate. How should the rate of increase be structured? If the standard changes to increase to 100% by 2030 or a certain date, then how should that rate of increase be structured? Any proposals?
Sort of clarifying question.
Yes.
So it's an interesting question. I'm just trying to remember if we've had any discussion in this group about, is it a straight line? Are we doing something else for some sort of strategic reason? I don't recall conversation around how to get there other than sort of a straight line, just to give us a sense of the relative.
I don't know that this group has specifically talked about this question.
I think we're asking, is it a concern? Should it be a straight line?
I would just say a couple of things. One is, those planning horizons for us are important, right? We need time to be able to shift. And so in some ways, a straight line is fine depending on when it starts, right? So we need time to adjust to that. We've been very focused on sort of closing that gap by 2030, but doing more at the back end of that than in the early end of that. Also because the renewable energy development field is going through a lot of change right now. And so that's been impacting some of our decisions and some high prices that appear to be coming down. So lots of moving pieces. The other thing is some of the other questions we answer about a tier 1A or how much tier 2 also would impact our ability on those pieces if there's complexity. So if it's just as it is now, tier 1A, relatively easy with a built-in planning horizon to get there in a straightforward way. The rest is, it depends.
So you're watching the overall level of complexity with standard all tiers, but mostly tier 1 and 2.
Correct.
In order to answer that question, because where there's more complexity in one place, it needs to be simpler in another.
Yeah, and again, just the more complexity, right, the longer of a timeline that we need to be able to build and incorporate that into our planning.
Quick question for utilities. So you are on like a 3-year cycle for the investment, your plans that you present at the PUC?
Oh, all right.
Yeah. So how far does that push you out already? I mean, are you really to 26 in your current plans that have just gone through, or?
We're just about to do one, so that'll be 3 years out from there. But it doesn't matter that much for us because we already planning for it.
And Ken, I see you shaking your head. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, I have about 30 minutes of comments, but to keep it very short, I mean, we buy power in 5-year blocks typically. That seems to be the sweet spot between the regulatory requirements stepping up substantially and getting a longer term deal to lock in reasonable pricing. So anything that like does an immediate jump throws all our planning into turmoil. So I would agree with Rebecca that backloading the requirement, maybe a little slower ramp up in the beginning and more at the end would help alleviate my concerns with going to 2030. And this is more around tier 2, but I think it applies to tier 1 as well. When we're talking to developers, supply chain is getting worse, not better. I had a call yesterday with a developer who said getting switchgear and transformers is now 14 months. So that, again, and I keep saying this, I'll reiterate, if I agree to a contract today, they can't start constructing for 14 months. That's after they get the permits. And then they're having to put money at risk that they're actually going to get through the process. So this is not something we can turn on a dime. It's going to take time to plan and construct.
Thanks, Ken. Are there other unique comments, thoughts related to how the rate of increase could be structured? Or questions? Co-chairs, do you have any other questions related to this piece? Ellen, do you have any questions or clarifications related to impacts of how it gets worded, structured, defined around?
Nope.
Rate of increase? No. You do that? Yes.
Yeah, just could someone give me an example of how we could backload this?
Like what it sounds like?
Yeah, what it sounds like.
So you could do like an exponential ramp up. So instead of going straight to 10% each year, you could start much lower, and you could embed the actual amounts in the statute that are required every year. So it could start, I don't know, 5%, and go to 8%, then go to 10%, then go to 15%. And you could potentially embed that in the statute, so that it was closer to what it is currently, and then it would have to be significantly more closer to 2030.
So I guess I'd like to understand if there's kind of consensus around the notion of we should try and backload this for supply chain and other issues.
Are there any reservations about backloading if there were this kind of increase? Is there any drawback to doing that?
One thing I thought I heard was it depends on the kind of other changes we make. So it may not be something people are ready, I mean, people may be, but
come back to it.
We may need to come back to it.
Well, and as a reminder, these are all straw polls in part because one of the things you're understanding is that all of these decisions do hang together. So you take a first pass and then you end up coming back again.
One little nuance is that I think we've had conversations repeatedly about not one size fitting all. So it could be that some utilities are straight line, they're already planning it, and would to go any slower would to sort of be a loss to the whole system. So, but some might not be able to move at that pace cost effectively. So we have a mix and match sort of solution.
So we've got two comments online. Mia, and did you also have your hand up?
I did, yeah. I was definitely after Bill, I'm not sure about that.
So Mia, Bill, and then Ben.
Not to bang this drum over and over again, but with impacts on households, I'm very sensitive to the planning needs of the utilities, but the more we smooth out the rate increases, the less of a shock it will be to households trying to accommodate that in their budget. So just want to keep that in mind. Thanks.
Yeah. William? Looks like you put your hand down.
Yeah, just for the sake of argument, I think given whether it's 2030 or 2032 or whatnot, it's such a short time frame. I'm not sure why you need annual or biannual. I don't know why you need intermediary requirements. If utilities know where they need to be in 6 or 8 years, I would think they'd be able to find their best course without, because any kind of similar to what Senator Bray said, the one size does not fit all. Any fixed schedule is likely not to really correspond very precisely with the kind of time frames and steps that like Ken and others have outlined. So just my thoughts.
Thank you. Ben?
I'd just say from VPERC's perspective, and I think probably speak for some of the other environmental organizations in the room as well, having flexibility in the near term or a slower ramp leading to a faster ramp in the out years, especially for tier 1, which sort of in practical terms is more about existing renewables, seems reasonable. Certainly want to go as fast as we can, but also absolutely respect that there are existing contracts in place and not wanting to have rate impacts that we don't need to see because of screwing up existing planning and contracts.
So that's a question we can bring to Brattle Group at 10:15 when they come in to see what sort of insight they might have. I'm sure there's going to still be a lot of uncertainty in that question, but we'll bring it back around at that point. Do you have other questions around this piece, the rate of increase and how it should be structured, or are you ready to move on to the next? Sounds like a yes, a quiet yes. So discussion, so I'm on question 4 now. Regarding the option to create a tier 1A, which in my very generalized understanding is about differentiating a new regional renewable. Let's take a moment to outline your reasoning behind this option. And first, I think I might need somebody with more knowledge than I to explain what a tier 1A or a regional renewable tier means. I've seen it show up in the modeling, and I know people have sort of talked about it a bit, but I don't know if you're talking about the same thing or what your definition is. Do you have a definition?
Well, I'd like to add to your question. I also am not sure that when I hear people use the word regional, that I know exactly what that means. Does that mean ISO proper? Does that mean you can bring power in from grids next door? Does that include HQ? I don't know what our quote unquote region is in that question.
Yep, okay. So what is meant by regional, what's included or not? First, the definition, what is tier 1A?
Well, I can talk about how it's included in the modeling, which may be appropriate. And so we call it regional tier in the modeling. So if you look at that, it just says regional, but it is new renewable resources constructed after 2010, anywhere in New England or that could be imported into New England.
Okay. Does that differ from anybody else's understanding of what that means? No.
Can I ask just TJ then? So with that definition, that is sort of the status quo, like these are all the current sources of power available to us now and in use in Vermont now. Right? There's no one that's being removed from the pool of eligible by that definition.
Correct. I will say in the model there is a toggle for biomass. So in the model you can turn biomass on and off in the model, but otherwise, yes.
And that's any size?
Any new resource, yeah, any size of resource.
Ken, did you have a question?
I had a comment. I disagree with TJ's characterization slightly. 2010, as I understand it, was picked in order to bring the wind projects into the new regional tier. But there are other Vermont-based projects that would qualify for tier 1 but not be eligible for tier 1A, given the structure.
I'm sorry, Peter?
Right. When we envisioned a new tier 1A, one of the things we did not envision being included was new large hydro. So, we can pick a number to define it, but I think generally what we're talking about is any new flooding in Quebec, in Hydro-Quebec territory would not count under tier 1A. Now, if Quebec was to bring on new wind resources, we could definitely talk, that our vision was that would be included. But anything new that's flooded, new hydro that's large in Quebec would not be included in our vision in tier 1A.
And is that different from yours, TJ?
The model, I don't believe shows any new flooding or new imports from, then from Canada. There's got to be, big new transmission investment, for example. So, but in terms of the definition, I think it was eligible, but it didn't actually show up. And so I don't think it was addressed in the model.
That's important. When we're voting on this, we should be clear which one.
Yeah.
Which definition you're using for regional?
Yeah. Well, for renewable.
What's defined as a new renewable under tier 1A? We should be very clear. This is a straw poll, so we have to do it, but we have to be clear about that.
I have a practical question maybe for Peter and TJ. My rough sense of Hydro-Quebec is it's something in the order of a 43 gigawatt system. So if it were to go to 44 with one additional gigawatt related to large hydro, how do you but you have contracts with HQ as a supplier. How do you differentiate? How would you ever attribute a contract to one particular portion of their portfolio? How would you exclude it in order to prevent it undermining the intent of tier 1A? I don't know how that works legally or practically.
It's a good question. Canada does not have the same renewable energy certificate tracking system that New England does. But they do track for the greenhouse gas inventory, et cetera, and ensure that power that has been delivered under contract, if the contracts are specific to a resource, are not counted in their greenhouse gas inventory. Massachusetts, for example, has a clean energy standard, existing clean energy standard, and they specify plants for which the power is eligible. So I can't tell you the details of how the legal mechanics of that, but I do believe there is a path for it to happen.
Ben?
So one additional point on that, I think, so in statute currently, the definition of new renewable energy has sort of a sub part that says plants from within a system of generating plants aren't considered new renewable. I think that, in practical terms, if you have a contract with Hydro-Quebec that includes like new wind, but as part of the sort of larger HQ mix, that would probably kick that out. I would think that would be part of the statute we need to look at, but I'll, reiterate what Peter said from our perspective. New wind and solar from, New York, from Quebec is just as good as new wind or solar from, off the coast of Massachusetts, right? Like it all reduces greenhouse gases. So we're comfortable with that. It's the, in particular, the methane impacts from new large hydro. That's, why we would not want to see that eligible for the new renewable tier, and, similar concerns on new biomass.
I had one concern and now I have two. So sorry for that. My first concern is the 2010 date. Washington Electric members spent millions of dollars to build Coventry coming online in 2005. They put their money out there first and building a big renewable plant. And I don't know why they should be penalized versus those who came later. I'm not sure in practical terms this would do that, but just picking a date 5 years after our members made their investment in a big renewable plant raised some concerns for me. I just want to flag that mostly because I don't want to surprise anybody in the legislature when we come to that time if that becomes an issue. My other concern related to Coventry is, as Ben says, I don't think we want to disincentivize the expansion of existing renewable projects in Vermont. And so I think we need to consider how we treat new for current plants that are expanded, whether those are wind projects that have additional turbines installed, or whether those are an expansion of Coventry, or whether those are other types of resources. I don't think we'd want to exclude those from being considered new renewables. And I'm not sure we would, but I just want to lay that flag out there that I don't think anybody around the table would want to do that. So.
Right.
Ben, and then Peter.
But just to be clear, Louis, if you were to expand Coventry, it would still count under tier 1. So it's not really a disincentive, it's just which pot you put it in, right?
It would still count on tier 1, but it wouldn't count towards any tier 1A obligation.
Yeah, but you could still do it and still have it be counted as renewable.
Well, sure, we could build it even if it wasn't counted as renewable and sell the power into the market, but we probably wouldn't do that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand the distinction there, and I agree.
Because you said disincentive, and it just makes it sound like you would, to me, I heard like you would be able to move forward with a project that would bring new renewables online.
Well, any reduction in financial benefit to a project is a disincentive compared to those that would receive it, right? So maybe I won't complicate it anymore except to say I agree with you. Thanks.
Yeah, Ben.
So I think this is already covered under current statute and would also need to be tweaked if we're moving the date back. There's, as part of the definition of new renewable, there's also a piece that says, basically, if you upgrade a plant and expand the ability, how much power it's generating, then that can count as new renewable. The incremental addition can count as new renewable. The definition there is based on 2015. So if you pull that back to 2010, I think you get, the couple of turbines you've got there, plus any new ones. The incremental piece post 2010 would be included, not the initial ones. But
understood. Yep. Thank you.
You can, I just have a quick question. What you're talking about just then is how renewable is defined in tier 1 currently. And you're talking about the date, pulling it back from 2015 to 2010.
Well, really the definition of new renewable, and there are a couple of places in that definition, and it's sort of subparts where the date comes in.
Okay.
And so I would imagine if we're moving that date back to 2010 or another number from 2015, you would also move the definition for retrofits back to 2010 from 2015.
So there is a question it's in the queue, but it's a couple questions away about asking who wishes to consider changes to the definition of resources that qualify for tier 1. And right now you've been specifically talking about tier 1A. I know there are some comments. I just needed to get those questions nailed down so I could come back to them. So Senator Bray and then Chase, it looks like you might have a comment too.
I can hold the question. It's related to the date. For someone who thinks moving from the current 2015 back to 2010 is a good idea, if they share the thinking behind that. There is something that's sort of on the face of it, somewhat counterintuitive. We're talking about trying to incentivize new renewables, but we're moving the date for what's new back in time. So it'd be helpful to square that up.
And part of what I was hearing is the rationale that is if it might include expansion on those projects if you move the date back. Are you talking specific to tier 1A, or you're thinking about just tier 1, the definition?
If people want to talk about it now, I just don't want to keep adding.
You don't want to lose it.
Well, want to hold on to the question.
So if you envision a future where we're getting 100% of our power from renewables, and you had a resource that, let's say, built in 2010, that was no longer eligible, right? Because it's not a renewable, then you would be disincentivizing that project to keep running. So if you think of, let's say, a wind project in East Kingdom, you would be able to keep it running. It wouldn't count because it was not built in time, right? If we're not, as long as we're not at 100% renewable energy future, it doesn't matter. You can keep running that thing and selling the credits and doing your thing. But once you get to 100% renewables, you wouldn't be able, it wouldn't qualify. So it'd be very hard to keep that project running. And that really makes no sense to not have that project running, as an example.
it couldn't run under just under tier one.
Can I jump in? Sorry, I know I'm talking a lot, but I hope I'm providing some valuable clarification. When we initially proposed, and I think this really is something that came from the environmental organizations working on this, the move from 2015 to 2010, the thinking was we've got not just wind, but a lot of solar and some other smaller resources, including I think some farm methane that was really built because of and through Vermont energy policies, including the standard offer, which started in 2010. And so in the interest of providing, with sort of additionality as the North Star, meaning if we're getting a resource, we're using a resource, does that cause more renewables to come online in Vermont or anywhere else? Really is like that, the focus. If we have those earlier resources driven by Vermont policy retired in Vermont, that means new renewables going to be built somewhere in the region. And that also provides a little bit more flexibility for the utilities, which is something that we've heard over and over again is helpful. So I don't know what decisions they would make on, retiring RECs from a wind or solar project under one of those programs. But opening up that possibility, I don't see a downside because it potentially has a small downward pressure on the rate impact and just as much positive impact from a greenhouse gas or an additionality standpoint. So that's where our thinking on it is.
May I ask Ben a clarifying question? Ben, why, I understand your approach and I understand that explanation, thank you. Why choose 2010 instead of just choosing on date of passage and then adjusting the amount of the tier 1A commensurate with that? In other words, you set a standard and then you try to lessen the impact by lengthening the length of time. Why not just set the standard, let's set the date at the time of passage of the bill and adjust the amount of tier 1A down slightly, if I'm making sense, and maybe I'm not.
You are, and from our perspective, the reason to do it the way that we are supporting instead of what you just described is greenhouse gas impacts. If we're adjusting tier 1A down and keeping the date, upon passage, as you described, then that means that there will be less additionality, less new renewable energy will be coming online in the region more broadly than if, say, RECs from Lowell Wind, for instance, were retired in Vermont. I don't know who owns those right now, but probably utilities in Massachusetts or Connecticut. If we sort of rehome those in Vermont, and Vermont utilities do, then you're going to see those utilities elsewhere need to go procure more renewable energy from other projects, which
will result in more projects being developed in the region.
That's exactly right. And that's why we're proposing to move the date and keep the requirement a little bit higher instead of not move the date and reduce the requirement. More greenhouse gas reductions.
Thanks.
So we have two comments online, Chase and then Ken. We're also coming up towards the break. So as always, I'm encouraging brevity at this particular point. Go ahead, Chase.
I won't take that personally.
No, it's not about personal. No, it's actually, I think there might be some of these questions here that will gather some of this insight in a more structured way so you can really use it in terms of pros and cons for certain proposals. But Chase, the floor is still open. Go ahead.
Thanks. I mostly just wanted to speak to the regional aspect of tier 1A and just say that I agree with the way that it was framed as ISO New England and those energy sources that can be transmitted into ISO New England. And I just wanted to make one point here that I see as important, which is that there would have to be a requirement that the electricity would actually be able to enter the ISO New England system. If not, then we get into a potentially sticky situation in which RECs could be acquired from far away and used in Vermont when that energy could not itself actually enter Vermont or enter this grid. And so I think then that basically I'm agreeing with the language. I just want to make sure that we are paying very close attention to the actual importation of energy being in fact possible in order for that energy to be creditable here.
Thank you. Is this a follow-up?
Yeah, just a really clarification for anybody who knows it better. Other than HQ, do we, for instance, take New York Power right now? I'm not clear if that counts for tier one as it exists today.
Yes, it does.
Okay, thanks.
We take, the municipals at least get power from Niagara, the Niagara power plants, the NIPA power, that counts as tier one.
Thank you. As do we. Thanks.
Okay, Ken?
Yeah, I just, intended or not, I'm not sure, but I just have to say, moving the date on tier 1A to 2010 actually creates winners and losers amongst the utilities. It's the reason I've been pounding on this. We got to look utility level, not statewide level. I don't know that we need to solve the issue that's created within tier 1A, but I think we may want to look at changes to tier 2 to level the playing field here, because by moving the date to 2010, you actually are allowing GMP, since they own Lowell, and those utilities that have long-term contracts for Sheffield wind end up with more flexibility in tier 1A than those who didn't make investments in those projects. And so that puts a financial detriment on those other utilities. And I would hope we could find another way within the res to equal the playing field here.
Thanks, Ken. Yes, please.
Yeah, Ken, so can you say just a little more, please? Because usually when people talk about leveling a playing field, it's in a competitive situation, right? So to what degree are DUs competing, and how does that impact your choices and flexibility?
Sure. If you're going to create a tier 1A and say that Lowell or Kingdom Community Wind qualifies, then Green Mountain Power has those RECs already at their disposal. They can choose what to do with them to meet the requirement. Those utilities that don't own the wind projects that now miraculously qualify because of the 2010 date have to go to the open market and buy RECs that qualify for tier 1A. My expectation is those RECs will be more difficult to acquire and potentially cost more than the RECs that are already in hand. And they will certainly change our planning. So they'll cause additional contracts to be entered. So the utilities that don't have generation that would meet the 2010 date, once it's moved back, are going to have to make different market decisions to comply with this new requirement, where the utilities that already have those contracts in hand can move some ships around, deck chairs around the ship, and meet their needs. And that's just what I'm trying to point out, is I'm envisioning that a tier 1A with a 2010 date will be detrimental to the VEPSA members because we do not have Kingdom Community Wind or Sheffield Wind in our portfolio.
Can I just have a question? Detrimental in that it then constrains the choices for your utility?
It's going to require us to buy something on the market we don't already have and potentially sell something we do have. And I don't know what that cost will be, but I anticipate it will be higher.
Thanks, Ken.
Okay. So process-wise, we're at a time when a break was advertised. It might make sense to take a break now, and then when we come back, go through those structured questions. I think the place where I'd probably suggest you start is defining a new definition for our new renewable in tier 1A. That's separate from looking at how tier 1 renewables are defined. And then go through the questions as listed in the agenda. Does that make sense, co-chairs? I'm looking for another brain on this one.
Sounds good to me. It's 5 of 10. How long break?
10 minutes, so that means you go till 10:05. and then back to the table. Okay, we're on break. Thanks.